Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lecture. We're going to do Rome today, and this is going to be kind of like our Greek PowerPoint that we did in class. There's a lot of information on this Rome PowerPoint, and we don't need all of it. We just need to get the skeleton of Rome and how it went, but if it's online, so if you want to go back and you want to look over the PowerPoint of Rome to get the details, then be my guest. It can't hurt, but for the most part, I believe on the AP exam, this is way more detailed than what you need to know. So I'm going to give you what you need to know here that I think would be the AP exam. If you have time, go back and look it over. It's interesting stuff, right? Okay, so start off with a map here of the Italian peninsula. Now in the beginning, and you know you read in your textbook about the myths of Romulus and Remus, and that's all very interesting, but the reality is that the first Romans were the Latins, and the Latins lived in the area around Rome. They were sheep herders, and they moved into that area very early on in the Greek period, whereas, Athens and was really high. The Latins were still kind of a small group of people living in that area of Rome. It's a great place. It's got 7 hills. It's got 3 rivers, and the rivers are deep enough to where ships can sail from the coast all the way in, and so it was a nice spot for trade. It wasn't close enough to the coast that you had to worry about invasion or attacked by pirates, and it was further enough inland. It had fertile soil. Once they drained the swamps around the different fields, they were able to support a pretty large population, and so they established a really solid society here around the area that we'll know as Rome. Now, they had company. A lot of people lived on the Italian peninsula early on. To the north here, we're going to talk about the Etruscans, and the Etruscans were one of the largest kingdoms that existed. And if you're familiar with this area of Italy, it's very rocky, more industrial. And so when we talk about the Etruscans, we'll talk about their influence, and it deals with that kind of rocky, mountainous lifestyle. In the south, which is, of course, more tropical, it's farmland. Those were your Greek colonies. Again, Greece is just right here. And so the Greek ships would sail and establish many of these cities down here with Greek temples and Greek art and Greek culture. And so they would also influence the Romans. So the Latins would be in the middle, the Etruscans to the north, and the Greeks to the south. Okay, so they were the Latins, sheep herders. They lived along the Tiber River, which is the main river in Rome. And they built the first settlement along the hill known as the Palatine Hill. Now, if you're watching this, we are from Rome, Georgia, right? And Rome was named after Rome, Italy. And one of the reasons why is because we have 7 hills and we have 3 rivers. And some of the hills in town, if you're familiar, to the day students, are named after those hills in Rome. You have an Apennine Hill, right, and other types of hills, but they also have Myrtle Hill, which is not in Rome, Italy. And so the Palatine is going to be the main hill where most of your government buildings and things were built in or around that hill. Okay, the Greeks were in the south, as we said, established about 50 colonies in southern Italy. Now, the Greeks are going to influence the Romans in very important ways. First and most evident is the idea of religion, right? And many of you are familiar. You just take the Greek gods and you change their name and you make them Roman gods. And some names are actually the same, like Apollo is the same. But Zeus becomes Jupiter, and Ares becomes Mars, and so forth and so on. If you want to know the Roman gods' names, all you really have to do is memorize the planets, because each planet is named after a Roman god. But they also have a Greek personality. Yeah, that was Greek, and that was Rome, right? And if you want to get really picky about it, and some of my students do, they love to correct me when I'm talking about Greece but use a Roman name, or talking about Rome but use a Greek name. They love that. But anyway, and so it's essentially the same religion, a polytheistic religion based on those Greek gods, right? The next thing they influenced, of course, was art and architecture, which is very closely related to religion, as we learned when we studied the Greeks. And so Roman temples are just evolving Greek temples, and the Roman statues are many times copies of Greek statues. And so that was very similar to Rome and Greece, and that's why we call Rome the greatest Hellenistic civilization. They did the most to copy the Greeks in religion and art, and also in politics, especially Athens and its democracy. And we're going to study that as well. And agriculture. The Romans learned to grow olives and grapes from the Greeks, and so they used that in their society as well. So the Greeks influenced the Romans a lot, and that's the most evident. Rome looks like Greece. It's just changed a little, yes? To the north, we talk about another civilization that's not as well known as the Greeks. They were a Hellenistic civilization, and they are called the Etruscans, and they settled in that area in northern Italy. Now, they will also, however, have a very important influence on the Latins. Okay, namely, they give them ironworking, they give them architectural techniques like the arch, and they also give them their writing and their numbers. Right, so metalworkers create the arch system of writing adopted by the Romans. They conquered Latinium and dominated the Latins for 600 years, from 600 BC to 509 BC. Okay, so the Etruscans, their influence comes from conquest. So they come down into the Roman area and they absorb Rome into their northern empire. And so Rome, or the city of Rome, is ruled by a line of Etruscan kings, right? And they grew under the Etruscan kings and became kind of a bustling city under these Etruscan kings. The area of the city that grew up in the center, that became the center or the political heart of Rome, would be known as the Forum. And this area of government buildings that became the heart and political power of Rome, right? Now, eventually, this is interesting. And so we're looking at the Temple of Hera in Italy. This is a Greek temple, but it is found in Italy. And so this is a great example of how the Greeks built there, lived there, and eventually would influence the Romans. Okay? This is an example of Etruscan art here, and it's a tomb art. We look at this as a sarcophagus, kind of, and so we have like a couple buried underneath the lid of the sarcophagus. And if you were in art history class, we'd go into somewhat more detail about like the relationship between husband and wife, or at least this husband and wife. But the Etruscans, as you can see, it is kind of Hellenistic. They do have that Greek look to their faces, but it isn't as advanced as like a Hellenistic statue would be, we would think. Right? So the Etruscans. Okay, the last Etruscan king was overthrown in 509 BC, and Latin, or Rome, becomes an independent city-state. Right? And from the first, the people of Rome made the promise to themselves that they would not have another king. They didn't want another king. They wanted to rule themselves. And so they had specific laws written down to avoid monarchy or dictatorship or rule by one person, right? An autocrat, as we would say. So they formed what we would call a republic. Now, remember in our conversation with Greece, the difference between a republic and a democracy. It is very similar, but it is based on population, right? You have too many people to all go vote, and so you vote for people to represent you to vote. Now, there was voting and not voting. Let me explain. There were two classes of people in early Rome, right? There were the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy were considered the patricians. Now, they didn't base their wealth like we based our wealth, which would be money. Their lineage really gave them the position that they had. So the patricians were the wealthy landowners whose families helped found the city of Rome. So you could trace your family tree all the way back to the beginning of Rome, and you were a patrician family, or the aristocracy of Rome. Now, everyone else, the workers and the poor and the middle class, those type of people, those who could not trace their family tree all the way back, were known as the plebeians. Now, these terms might sound familiar to you, especially if you've got a brother or sister in college and they pledge a fraternity or sorority. They're plebes, they're patricians. We use these phrases all the time in academia, especially in college, right? So the plebes were the common farmers, artisans, merchants. They were the majority of people. They could vote, but they were limited in their voting. So here's the way this works. And here's how it's different from Washington, D.C., right? If you're a patrician, then you're a patrician for life. There's nobody that can vote you out of that position, right? And so it's a family seat in the forum. You sit there, and when you die, your son sits there, and so forth, right? So that's not what's voted on. Other things are voted on, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so the Senate is the main governing body of Rome. It's where we get the name, right? The governing body of Rome made up of patricians. So all the patrician families and all the representatives of the families would sit in the Senate and would discuss Roman law, right? The councils were those patricians who were voted on to run the Senate. So they're not a king, but they're kind of the speaker of the Senate, yes, because we have that in the U.S. And so these are two leaders elected by the Senate from the patrician class to serve as the leaders of the government for 1 year. So they kind of focus and consolidate laws. They do have quite significant power to rule over court cases and make judgments and things like that. And so they would rule for 1 year. There would be two of them. Right, so they would have balance. Checks and balances is what we're talking about. You have tribunes, and this was interesting. Tribune was an original position in the Roman Senate, but what happened was the plebes became irritated that they didn't have a voice. And of course, as we've learned, when wealthy people control the government, they pass laws that benefit the wealthy. And so the plebes really felt left out. And there are a couple of instances in Roman history where the plebes would just leave the city and just not work and close all their shops. And the patricians couldn't do anything. And so they had to invite the plebes back and promise reforms. And one of those reforms was the position of tribune. So two patricians, right, get to go to the plebe side of town during, a certain season, and they would make these political speeches that I will speak for you in the Senate, and I will help pass laws that benefit you, and here's your grievances, and I've heard them. And so they were running for office, and they would be voted on, and they would be elected if they were successful as a tribune, and there would be two of them. And they would elected, and they would represent the plebes in the Senate. Now, we got maybe 300 senators with two plebes or two tribunes. I mean, what voice are they going to have? But it's something. They're able to voice their concerns. Now, the question you might ask at this point is, why would a patrician want to lower themselves to speak for the plebes? Why don't they just, they're set. They've got a seat. Nobody can vote them out, right? But this was actually considered to be a stepping stone to council. And so after you were a tribune, a lot of times you just run for council, and it was kind of, okay, you were a tribune, and therefore you qualify. And so a lot of patricians wanted to do it because they felt that it was the next step on the ladder to get to council, right? Centurion assembly is another form of government. Again, we're really a little detail here. So these are citizen soldiers made up of life select councils, and they make laws, right? Okay. Tribal assembly, another group that would make laws. We get a little detail. The 12 tablets. Okay, now the 12 tablets you need to know. And this is essentially the Constitution of Rome, right? These are the laws set down at the beginning of the Republic that said this is how we live our lives. And they were on public display in the Forum. Any citizen of Rome could walk by and read all of them. They probably had them in their books, and so children in school learned about them, just like our Constitution. They expected citizens to be very up on these ideas of the 12 tablets. Now, in times of emergency, the government realized that, you did not have time to vote on laws and discuss and debate laws. You just had to make decisions. So in times of invasion or famine or natural disaster or whatever, the Senate would elect a dictator. And that dictator would be a king, for a particular period of time in order to make quick decisions. So he was chosen by the council, elected by the Senate to rule over Rome in times of emergency, and his term would last for 6 months. And then the Senate would reassess if they still needed a dictator or if he could go home. And there are very famous examples of patriotic dictators that would come to power and help the city and then give up their power and go back and be a farmer again, right? One in particular, if you have time to read about a guy named Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was kind of the George Washington of Rome. He did his duty as a citizen and then went back home, right? And so, a lot of good stories there. We do not have time to get to them, which makes me sad. Okay, there we are. So this is a painting, a pretty famous painting of the Roman Senate. I don't know what that guy did. He's not very popular, right? And so this is actually a famous moment in the Senate where we have Cicero speaking, and it's take a Rome class. It's great. All right, 12 tablets. There it is. They're putting them up in the Forum, and people are doing it. And again, it was very involved in religion. See this right here. They're sacrificing to the gods and thanking the gods for giving them these laws, and just go all the way back to Hammurabi. The gods give laws, and laws are the Moses. The God gives laws, and laws go to the people. And so this is what we have in Rome as well. We're very close to the Forum. You have the Temple of Jupiter. And the Temple of Jupiter, is very connected to the idea of the power of Rome. Okay, the fasce is an interesting symbol of Rome. And you can see this on the exam. They might have a picture of a fasce and ask, what is the purpose of this? And the fasce represents the power of the council, right? And so he would have the power to punish, and he also have the power to execute. And so what you have is this weird connection here, this weird combination of rods, that you beat someone with, and an axe that you execute someone with. And they're tied together in this bundle, and everywhere the council would go, his servants would walk in front of him with these fasce. And the fasce would, and so he has the power to punish. He has the power to execute. Now, how does that influence us today? Well, look, this is our House of Representatives. On either side of where the president speaks is a fasce. Why do we have fasces in our Congress? It's Roman. It's very Roman, isn't it? Crazy. All right, now, the Forum. This is a good shot of the Forum in its heyday. With buildings, and it was, a pretty impressive place. You think of Washington, D.C., and how Washington, D.C. was built to impress. The Forum was built to impress, right? Okay, so the Army. all citizens were required to serve in the army. And many historians believe this was the strength of Roman society, and this is what allowed Rome to grow so quickly and so successfully, is the fact of the citizen soldier. And, you have to be willing to give your life for Rome, and you can participate in the government of Rome, just like in Athens with the hoplites, right? But what we have is we have two classes of soldier. We have wealthy patrician soldiers, and we have plebeian soldiers. Your wealthy patrician soldiers served in the cavalry and would be officers and trained to be generals. Your plebe would be a foot soldier, and he would be part of the legion. Now, as a young patrician boy, you took classes in, mathematics and reading and writing, but you also took classes in military strategy. And so as a senator, as an adult, you could be called upon at any time to lead an army. And you had to know how to do that because you had to training as a young boy. So any of the senators could step in and lead a legion, right? That was what they were trained for. And any plebeian child would grow up to be a soldier and serve in that legion. Okay, and it was all together, all as one. And that type of military unity gives you unity as a citizenship as well. Okay, so the legion was 5,000-foot soldiers, including cavalry. The century was the next level down. And the rankings of our modern military is really kind of based on the Roman military, with this number of people in legion, this number of people in a century, all the way down to 10 in a platoon. And that's the way we structure our military today. Here we go. There's a guy, the soldier, not a phalanx, right, but very organized and very structured, right? Your armor was structured, and the way you did things was structured. And again, take a class on Rome. It's really interesting. It's fascinating how they built this Roman military machine. And at its height, it was unbeatable. No one could beat it at its height, right? Okay, this is an example of kind of a shield wall, kind of strategy they would imply. Interesting stuff there. In the legions, they would have these things called eagles, and the eagle was your legion, right? It was the symbol of your legion. And so maybe you're familiar with military stories where the idea is you can't drop the flag, you keep the flag flying, don't let the flag hit the ground. Well, that comes from the Roman eagle. The Roman eagle was the most precious thing to a legion. And if you lost your eagle, you lost your honor, right? And so you would die defending the eagle, which would be on a staff like this. And usually it was a golden eagle that would be up there, and you would carry it in front of your legion, right? Okay, so 390 BC. Now, Rome was a warlike people. Okay, they fought a lot. And then they fought, once they became a republic, they began to spread out to the north and south in the Italian peninsula. They fought and defeated the Etruscans. They fought and defeated the Greek city-states. And eventually they owned all of Italy. And so here's kind of a timeline of that. 390 BC, the Romans control all of central Italy, so they shore up that area. They begin to expand north and south. And by 265, they control all of the Italian peninsula. And then they fight these three major wars with a big city in North Africa called Carthage, and those are called the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars are from 264 to 146. And in those three wars, Rome wins all three and eventually controls all the Mediterranean. That's the very short version. And there's so many good stories in there that I don't have time to tell you, right? So first war, second war, this hurts my heart. Third war, Rome wins, right? And this is what they control after the Punic Wars. They control all of North Africa here. They control this area here. Briefly after the Punic Wars, they will come and defeat the phalanxes of Greece, the Alexander's progeny. They would defeat them, and eventually they would control all the Mediterranean. They would defeat Egypt, and the Mediterranean was called the Roman Lake, right? Okay, so the fall of the Republic. It got really big, and that's kind of a simple message, but you're almost a victim of your own success. With the defeat of all these different territories, you had a very prosperous business come into the Roman Empire, and that was the business of slavery. They would go to everywhere they conquered, and if you're a Roman soldier, one of the things that you could do to try to make a living for yourself after your soldiering was done was collect slaves. So you would go into a village that you conquered, and you would grab this family or that family, and you would take them back with you and sell them as slaves. It's kind of a business on the side. And so by the time we get to Rome controlling the entire Mediterranean, there are thousands and thousands of slaves in the Roman Empire. Right? And so now we have all these people that aren't citizens, and what do we do with them? And in addition to that, the wealthy people began to, and the line between patrician and plebeian began to blur. Wealthy plebes could buy their way into patrician positions, like even government positions, because they were really rich, because of slavery or trade or whatever. And so The rich people, I wouldn't say just say the patricians, but the rich people of Rome wanted to expand and live the life, the life of the wealthy man. And so they made laws that allowed them to go into the countryside and raise the rents on small farmers, right? And so they would do that. They would buy a bunch of land in the countryside, raise the rents on the small farmers there, kick them off that land, and create these large plantations. And I say the word plantation because that's what they were. And they called them the latifundia, right? And instead of growing like in America, we're used to plantation and cotton, right? But instead of growing cotton, they grew olives and grapes and vineyards and things like that. So they had huge plantations with all these olive groves and vineyards and things. And they wouldn't hire the farmers to work them. No. They would bring in slaves to work them. So where do the farmers go? The farmers are out of luck. They have to move to Rome or another city and try to find jobs there because they have no more land. So we're getting corrupt here, right? This corruption. And remember, the constant that we talked about. When you have a widening gap between rich and poor, then you're setting yourself up for rebellion and revolution, right? And that's what's happening in Rome. So large numbers of slaves, landless farmers, all those things, this really kind of volatile mix that's going on that will eventually cause the republic to fall, right? We have a slave revolt led by gladiators, right? You all heard gladiators. These gladiators, led by a gladiator named Spartacus, led this slave revolt. It was started with gladiators, and then other slaves came and joined them, and they rampaged up and down the Italian countryside for 3 years before the Roman legions were able to take care of them and kill and crush the rebellion. Right? We have 2 tribunes that are elected during this period of time that actually want to help the poor. It's crazy, I know, but that was their goal, and they are sometimes called the Gracchi or the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Both work really hard for reforms in Rome for the poor, and for their pains they are executed by the wealthy people. One is like murdered and his body's found in a ditch, and one is like murdered in a riot, right? And so these are the heroes of the people, and the heroes of the people have been killed by the rich. What are the people going to do? They're going to riot and rebel. And so in this volatile political climate, you have the, dare I say, the emergence of 2 political parties. Oh my gosh, right? 2 political parties. One are the optimates, and the optimates are for the wealthy. One are the populares, and the populares are for the poor, right? And so they represent the Gracchi. Moving quickly. Spartacus. Okay, this is a series on a TV show, I think. Okay, Civil War. Eventually, the optimates and the populares would gather arms and fight each other, right? At the end of the day, the optimates would win. They're led by a general named Sulla. Sulla is actually mentioned in the book. And here's why Sulla is important. Sulla comes back to Rome victorious, right? Marches his army into Rome, takes over the city, takes over the government, and makes himself dictator, right? Well, how long has he got? He's got 6 months. Well, guess what? He makes himself dictator for life. And so he's there until he doesn't want to be. And he runs the show, and he makes a blacklist of all the people who are the populares or who wronged him, and they're going to be executed. So you're either going to get caught or you're going to flee. So many of the senators that were on the populares side had to flee Rome while Sulla was alive, right? Sulla dies, and then you have one of the populares who fled Rome comes back after Sulla's death, and his name is Caesar. Okay? Now, this is, again, detailed. We're not going to get into all this, but Caesar is the guy, of course, that you need to know. And Caesar is very deliberate, and we look at Caesar's life and look at Caesar's plans, and the end of it is kind of foggy as to what his motivation was, but how he's going to get there was very clear. And with hindsight, we can see the whole thing. Caesar had to win the people, he had to win the wealthy, and he had to become a war hero. And to do all those 3 things, he become the leader or the person who controls the city of Rome. Okay? And so just some background about Caesar. He was from one of the oldest patrician families, the family of the Julii. But his father, who was a popularis, kind of spent all the money. And so he was broke by the time he came back to Rome after Sulla died. And it's not necessarily his fault because, he was on the run and stuff like that. So he has to build himself back up. So he does. He takes out enormous loans and throws major parties to get the wealthy on his side. They elect him consul, and he passes a bunch of laws to help the poor, get the poor on his side. And then after he's consul, he takes an army to what we call Gaul or modern-day France and conquers all of France. So here he is. He's a friend of the wealthy, friend of the poor, and a military hero. Check, check, and check. All right. So Caesar returns to Rome, And that's the thing. When he's in Gaul, conquering all these places and making a big name for himself, the senators are starting to get worried about what his intentions are. Does he want to be the leader of Rome? Does he want to be a dictator? And so they find something that he did while he was consul that they considered illegal, and they order him back to Rome, right, to face trial for his crimes. And he comes back to Rome, but he brings his army with him, right? And therefore they're like, they flee. And so the civil war starts between Caesar and the senators who don't like Caesar. Caesar will eventually win this war, right, and become dictator of Rome for life. Caesar. And he doesn't start this. If you look at him, he doesn't look young. He looks like a pretty old man. He's balding. He's wrinkled. He really didn't start this process. He was like in his mid-40s, I think. And so he was, by the time he became leader of Rome, he's like 60-something. And so he's getting up there. All right, so Caesar, of course, he begins sweeping reform as the dictator of Rome. He expands citizenry. He gives soldiers more land. He's changing everything. And change makes people nervous. And so there are still a group of senators that don't like him. And so they'll hatch a plot to murder him. And they do. On the Ides of March 14th, 44 BCE, the senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius stab Caesar in the Senate. They kill him at Tu Brute, right? Then falls Caesar. And another civil war breaks out between the senators who didn't like Caesar and Caesar's allies, which include his nephew, Octavian, who claims to be the adopted son of Caesar, which happened a lot. If you liked a kid and he was part of your family, you could adopt him as a son and he would inherit what you had, right? And Caesar didn't have a son, and so he adopted Octavian. So Octavian, Mark Antony, was Caesar's greatest general, and they join up and they defeat the senators and can take over Rome. So there's Mark Antony, and there's Octavian. Mark Antony was much older than Octavian. Mark Antony was kind of a jock. He was big and strong, and he looked like a general. He looked like a leader, right? But he was kind of dumb. Octavian was smaller, but he was smart. He was really intelligent, right? And he worked his way into Caesar's favors when he was just a teenager and just kind of tagged along with Caesar. And when Caesar died, he renames himself Caesar. I am Caesar now. And, starts making all these promises to people and whatnot. He was a pretty good politician. Okay, so in this now, eventually Mark Antony and Octavian would fight. And again, these are patterns in history. You can't have two dogs; you can only have one dog. These two dogs are going to fight, and so they do. They have this civil war. Octavian will win. Mark Antony will be defeated. And in this little plot, and this is some of the best stuff that I'm not going to be able to tell you, you enter in a girlfriend, and the girlfriend's name is Cleopatra, the Pharaoh of Egypt, right? And so Cleopatra and Mark Antony they join up against Octavian, and they fight. Octavian wins, and according to legend, Mark Antony stabs himself with his own sword, and Cleopatra has a serpent bite her on the breast, and she dies of poison. That's the legend anyway. But they both die. We know that. Okay, there's Cleopatra, right? Oh, it's so good. Take a Rome class. Okay, now, Octavian defeats them. Octavian becomes the first Caesar. So that's the trick question. Who is the first Caesar? It is not Julius. Julius was a dictator for life and was executed before he ever had a chance to become anything else. And that's what's foggy about his final days, is that we don't know if he wanted to be a king or if he just wanted to be dictator, and he would have given it up eventually. But he died before we know. So he is not the first Caesar. Augustus Caesar is the first Caesar, because he takes the title of his uncle's name and also names himself Augustus, which means the great, right? So no more Octavian, just Augustus Caesar. And all the other emperors after him will refer to themselves as Caesar, after Julius. There he is, Augustus Caesar. Now think back to the Greek PowerPoint that we talked about, right? We had the statue of, there's another one called Apollo Belvedere that we can look at. There was the statue of Hermes and Dionysus, and it looks a lot like this. Go back and look at it, right? And so we say Rome really kind of just copied the Greeks, and they did. So this is very much a statue of a Greek god, but done with Augustus's face, right? And here he is, the benevolent ruler. And this is what Caesars really tried to do with themselves, tried to make themselves godlike at this point. So the Republic is dead. No more Republic. The Senate is there, but they're a bunch of yes men. And the Caesar is the one who makes all the decisions. And so there you go. I snuck it in on you. But the Republic is gone, and the Empire is alive, right? Okay, so the Roman Empire at its height. We go from Augustus to what we call the five good emperors. And the five good emperors, ending with Marcus Aurelius, are going to extend the empire to this large. All the way, look at that. All that stuff, like Egypt, Spain, France. It is a massive, massive empire. Not as big as Alexander's. But it's still very big. Okay, so the Roman Empire, 10,000 miles long, from Mesopotamia, Britain to North Africa. Augustus replaced the Senate with just paid civil servants, people that were loyal to him, that ran like the different bureaucratic levels of the empire, right? Money and army and stuff like that. The power of the Roman army kept the peace. And so this is the period of time that we call the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, right? The army was so powerful that if you rebelled against the army or had a revolution, they would crush you. And so it's peace through force is really what it is. But it's still peace. Now see if this type of government sounds familiar to you. In each of the provinces of the Roman Empire, they would put a governor, right? And that governor would rule over the empire with the help of the local officials. And they would collect taxes and send everything back to Rome. As long as the people in the region obeyed the laws and paid the taxes, there would be peace. If they rebelled, then there would be war, and the Roman army would come and crush them, right? Does that sound like Persia maybe? Yes. See, there you go. And so the satraps and the Roman governors had a very similar time. Now, where did the Roman Empire have its biggest headache during the Pax Romana? That would be Israel, right? And the Jews. The Jews did not want the Romans there, and they rebelled against Rome. So the worst governor job that you could have would be Palestine, which is Israel. Okay, the stability of Rome depended on the peaceful transfer of power from one emperor to another. And in the five good emperors, we do have a peaceful transfer of power. The emperor clearly states who his successor should be, and when he dies, that successor comes to power. What's going to happen is when they start not having a clear successor is when things are going to go south. So the empire dominated Europe, Africa, Middle East for 200 years. 200 years we have this massive empire. And that doesn't include the Republic. That's just after Augustus Caesar and for 200 more years after that, right? And so this is the type of government we talked about. Roman governors collect taxes. Local rulers would rule the population. Many times, just like in the case of Palestine, the Roman governor would rule with a king. At the time, it was the king, the Herods. There were 3 Herods that ruled with the Roman governor in Palestine. And the Roman governor was the one in charge. They allowed the king and the religious leaders to have their time in the sun, too, so they could keep the peace. Civilization obeyed Rome. The Roman laws and paid taxes were left alone. All right, economy and trade. 90% of the people living in the Roman Empire participated in agricultural production. So it was very much of an agricultural empire, moving things back and forth, right? Roman Empire had a massive trading network known as the Silk Road. There we are. We've studied that, right? And so they would move things all the way through Alexander's old Greek empires, through India, and all the way to China, and then back again. And, of course, they traded in silk, but also spices, and they exported iron and grapes and olives and things like that for the silk and the spices that they would get back, right? So wealthy Romans sought luxury items from the East, silk of China, and spices from India. Purple dye was also a big thing during this period of time as well. If you were a patrician, you wanted a silk purple sash to go over your white toga, so everybody knew that you were wealthy, right? And the women, oh man, the women spent tons of money during this period of time on jewelry and spices and silks and food. The food became just like this. It changed completely. And one of the things I've heard historians say is that you can follow the history of the world through food and what they eat, right? And there are Roman cookbooks that we find that have like pepper and paprika and just all this stuff that they get from India that they used on their food to make it taste better. All right, so here we are. This is a picture of the Silk Road. We've seen maps like this, right? And we have the land routes and the sea routes moving through Asia and the Han Dynasty all the way to the Mauryan Gupta empires here, and the Seleucids and the Parthians, and eventually to Rome itself, right, and the Egypt, Alexandria, and so just this massive trade network. Now, with a trade network like this, what you have to have is you have to have solid empires that control large chunks of it, right? In the west, you have Rome. In the east, you have the Han. In the middle, you have the Mauryan Gupta. As long as they have those empires that can control and keep merchants safe, then trade works well. Once those empires start to break down, then the center has to shift, or traders won't go because it's just not safe enough. All right, so the decline of the empire. After the fall of the Republic, people become more loyal to the emperor than the Rome itself. Many historians, when they always talk about the decline of the Roman Empire, there are numerous volumes of books written about the decline of the Roman Empire, but most historians agree to this. The decline of the empire begins with the fall of the Republic, all the way back when Augustus becomes Caesar. Because before, in the Republic, if you were a soldier, you fought for your home, you fought for Rome, you fought for your family, you fought for that, right? Well, when you have a Caesar, you're fighting for a Caesar, and that doesn't inspire patriotism as much as it does to fight for your family and fight for your home. So many times, patricians who were once required to serve in the army actually paid someone else to do it. And eventually, most of the army is made up of either poor people who got money to be there, or foreigners, right, immigrants who move into the nation. And because the rich people didn't want to fight for Rome, they got kind of lazy. And that's really one of the big reasons why the republic begins to decline, because people stop caring. It's that simple. Yeah. The Romans stopped serving the army and instead pay others to take their place. The government is forced to allow foreigners and mercenaries into the army. Mercenaries are only loyal to their generals and not to Rome. And this is one of the things the general realized. If you paid your soldiers better, if you gave them more privileges and perks, then if you were challenged by the governor or by another general, those soldiers wouldn't say, no, I'm Roman, I can't fight for you. They would be your soldiers, not the soldiers of Rome. And this is where you start to get lots of civil wars where people are trying to be emperor by using the army that's loyal to them. Okay, so examples of this. Oh, the empire divides, right? And so the empire got too big. It was too hard to control. And so Diocletian in 284 decided he would split the empire into the eastern side and the western side, right? And the western side was the old side. That's the Roman side. The eastern side was the newer side. And it was actually gravitating that way because of Silk Road trade. And so it became the wealthier side as well. Finally, in 330 CE, Constantine would move his capital to the east and not the west. He left Rome and went to a city that he would create known as Constantinople. And so that would be the capital of the Western Empire, and he would put someone else as capital of the Eastern Empire, and he would put someone else as capital of the Western Empire, right? Constantinople is the central point of the city on the Silk Road, which is one of the reasons I chose it. And after the death of Constantine, the empire divides again. The east would continue to grow, but the west would decline. Okay, there's Diocletian on the left, and there's Constantine on the right. Okay, so the decline of the empire continued, and one of the major reasons for the decline of the empire was the influx of immigrants, okay? You had large groups of tribes from the Germanic side, or the eastern side, that began crossing into Rome over the Danube, and the Romans would let them in. They would, here, you can live here, you can be our cook, you can be our, servants. And so they welcomed them in so they could just collect taxes from them and there'd be servants. But they didn't treat them equally, right? Let's not just say immigrants are bad. They didn't treat the Germans well. The Germans served in the army as mercenaries, and they were considered second-class citizens, and there were a lot of prejudice against the Germans when they came over. And the key here is they're running from something. They're running from a very fierce nomadic tribe that lived on the European steppe that was pushing them west, and that tribe was known as the Huns. Yeah, so we'll talk about them in a second. Now, the Germans living in the Roman Empire served in the army, did all the things the Romans did, and eventually learned how to be Roman. They learned the strategies of the Roman army, they learned all that stuff. And so they were very equipped to serve Rome, but also very equipped to attack Rome because they knew exactly what Rome was going to do. Eventually, however, Attila would show up. Attila the Hun would show up in the Roman Empire, bring his Huns with him, right? And his invasion greatly weakened the Roman Empire. He didn't conquer Rome. He came very close, right? But they would weaken Rome to the point where it never recovered. So the German tribes rise up and conquer different areas of the empire. After Attila is gone, the Roman Empire is weak and corrupt. The German tribes just kind of take over. They just rise up and just take over the Roman Empire, right? Because they know everything that Rome does, and so they just take it over. So in 450, the Roman Empire is once again reduced to just only the Italian peninsula. They have recalled all the troops from different areas, and eventually it's just Italy now. In 476, the last Roman emperor named Romulus Augustus, who was 14, surrendered the Western Empire to the German king Odoacer, right? So the eastern half of the empire becomes Byzantine Empire. So that's the Eastern Roman Empire's Byzantine. It would last for another 1,000 years, but the Western Empire would be replaced by a religious institution known as the Roman Catholic Church. And that's what we say about the Roman Empire. It didn't necessarily fall. It shifted. It shifted from being a military, political power to a religious power, which would be Christianity. And that's what our next video is going to be on, okay? And so I'll put you well on your way to the idea of the Roman Catholic Church, which was the evolution of the Roman Empire. Here's the photo, it's not a photo, of the young 14-year-old Romulus surrendering the empire to Odoacer there. A sad day for the Roman Empire, right? But it was done. It was due. Okay? It was old and corrupt. It wasn't going to last. Yeah. All right, so that's Rome. I hope you enjoyed it, and watch it. If you have any questions, let me know. Okay? See ya.